For those of you that don't know me, my name is Emma Parry. I'm a professor of human resource management, and I'm also the head of the Changing World of Work group at Cranfield School of Management. And this is the latest in a series of webinars that we've been putting together actually for a year now. So this is our anniversary because our first one was in September 2020, really around the changing world of work. And really to get us thinking about some different perspectives on the changing world of work. So I'm really pleased to see some of you here today. A massive welcome to our webinar, and we're looking forward to including you in some of our conversations as we go through. So before we start, just to say a couple of things. As you will have noticed, we are recording this webinar. We record the webinars so that we can put them onto our YouTube channel and the website, and also obviously to make them available for other people. So thank you for approving that. Also to say we do try and have a profile on social media in the group. So if you are a social media person and you are tweeting, please use the hashtag Changing World of Work. And hopefully we can get some conversation going about that. I'm also part of the conversation today, so I'm not sure I'm actually clever enough to chair this, be part of the conversation and tweet. So, but I may try at some point, we will see. So I'm really happy today with this webinar because what we've done today is that we've tried to put together a really exciting group of people to come and talk to you. So first of all, we have a fantastic speaker who I've got to know recently, and I'm really, really happy to welcome her today. I will actually let her introduce herself, but just to say thank you, Natalie. Now, hi, great to see you. And also to say, because I know she's way too humble and shy to say this herself, is that one of the reasons that we've invited Natalie today is because she's written this great book, which is called Business Unusual. And we're going to draw on some of the ideas of that today, which are really about some of the ideas about values and the importance of values in the future world of work, and purpose-based organizations, and how things like that are growing in importance as we move forward. What we wanted to do today was bring together some different perspectives on this idea. So I'm also really, really pleased to welcome two people that are actually my colleagues at Cranfield. So firstly, Kevin Morrell, who has joined us quite recently as a professor in transformational strategy. And then a colleague for a longer time, Rosina Watson, who is head of our sustainability group. So Kevin and Rosina with myself will be giving some different perspectives. Obviously, I'll be taking an HR organizational behavior type perspective on the issues around values and the future world of work. And when we get to that point, we would also really like you to join in the conversation. So as Natalie is talking at the first part of this webinar, please do put your questions into the chat as they occur to you. And then when we get into the point that we will be discussing, please do join in the conversation. Raise your hand, unmute, or put questions in the chat, because we really want this to be a conversation and interactive rather than it be a formal presentation. So we're going to make this as informal and as interactive as possible. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass quickly now on to Natalie, and we will move on. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you. Thanks, Emma, for having me. Thank you, everyone, for welcoming me into this very exciting panel. So a little bit of background about me. I am someone who has written 2 books and talk with organizations and give webinars and lectures and consultancy in the realm of persuasive technology, ethics, the psychology of consumer behaviors. And my focus really is on kind of creating content that will act as Trojan horses to get businesses to create better environments in which to work and to have a more positive impact in the world. So Business Unusual is an attempt to bring different psychological tools, research, insights, and frameworks to help equip us to be more resilient and more pro-social and pro-environmental as businesses. So I'm going to share my screen with you now, and hopefully it will let me do the portion of the screen so I can show you my slides. Yes, can everyone see that? Excellent. Okay. So I'm going to speak with you for the next 10 to 15 minutes on this. I will make the slides available in case you want to dive into any of the references at your own leisure. And as Emma kindly said, put any questions in the chat so we can have them nice and fresh when we come out of this presentation. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the importance of self-determination, integrity, and the 4Cs framework that I've devised to help us enact our values in a consistent way in our businesses. So the first thing is to give a little bit of backdrop. We all know that in the last 18 months, so much has happened, whether it's in terms of mindsets and expectations or ways of communicating and working. Everything's shifted pretty rapidly and dramatically. And there are three key ways that are affecting businesses in particular. The first, of course, is that just like this webinar, our contact predominantly is virtual, it's remote, it's asynchronous. So you could be watching this in real time with me now, or maybe you're watching it on YouTube later. Our interactions have become increasingly mediated by technology, which means greater convenience and accessibility, but impoverishment in terms of non-verbal cues, gesticulation, warmth, sensory-based input, all of that stuff. And it means that as a result, when we're looking to reconnect with our peers, with customers, with colleagues, we're seeking more meaningful interactions and connections. And that's just a small snapshot of all of the things that we're seeing, but they're the places I want to start today. And so all of this is to say that we're really having to adapt quite quickly and quite deeply to a lot of the uncertainty and change that we're having to face right now. And of course, a lot of that comes into bringing the humane back into the digital transformation that businesses are undergoing. So given all the tech mediation and the hybrid, fluid, messy ways of getting back into physical place with each other, how can we use technology and use the social and behavioral sciences to empower people to flourish? Well, I think a good place to start is by looking at our three fundamental needs. Now, this falls under the umbrella of self-determination theory, and it was first proposed quite a while ago now by two psychologists named Ryan and Deshi. And they said that these three fundamental psychological needs are broadly universal, they're innate, they're essential, you find them across cultures and age. And if we are able to fulfill and meet these needs over the course of our lifespan, it can give us a greater sense of personal integrity, social integrity, and eudaimonia, which is about feeling like we're able to fulfill our potential as human beings, to self-actualize, which is more of a process than a definitive point, but to feel like we're making the most of our lives and who we can be. So what are these three psychological needs and how can we meet them? Well, the first of them, which is very exciting and that you probably will have had some experience grappling with this past 18 months, the first need is around autonomy. And this is about living in a way that feels authentic and uncoerced, where we have the full volition over our own behaviors. You're basically in the driving seat, making decisions about your life. So it's really at its heart about having a sense of agency. Now, of course, when we're thinking about online interactions and kind of the lens that I bring this in terms of user experiences, often what you find is that online interactions and user experiences tend to strip away the autonomy of the participants or the people engaging. So an example might be if you log in to watch, I don't know, 4 on demand and you're watching something and you get an advert and it's a personalized ad by a brand you've never interacted with and they're personalizing it to your name and you're thinking, well, hang on, they're stripping away my choice. I get served this ad without consent. They're taking my data without my consent and they're serving me something that I just didn't want to be interacting with in the first place. That's a good example of basically ignoring respect and consent as themes in the user experience. So there is another way to build back autonomy into the customer experience, especially when you're thinking about online marketing and messages. So whether you're an organization, a brand, or a shop, you can take this kind of approach, which is a bit different. So Bloom & Wild is a London-based florist who do beautiful bouquets. They put them through the post. I've used them before, really like them. And a couple of years ago, they received some emails just before Mother's Day requesting to opt out of marketing materials that talk about Mother's Day. So consumers were coming in and saying, look, I don't want to hear from you about this year. Please just take me off the list. And so rather than just take these few individuals who'd written in off the list, they sent out a simple email to their entire database and said, hey, Lottie, and since this was shared public on Instagram, wanted to get in touch as I know Mother's Day can be a very sensitive time. If you don't want reminders, opt out here. This simple strategy or intervention was so successful and got so many positive responses across all their social channels that they ended up off the back of it, taking it one step further. They publicly acknowledged the influx that they'd had, and they created what's known as the thoughtful marketing movement, which has lots of big brands now behind it, and which gives back the autonomy and agency to the customers connecting with the brands. That's one example. So that's the first psychological need for autonomy. The second innate universal psychological need is for competence. And this is about fulfilling our desire and wanting to be capable in achieving our goals. It's about skilling up and being able to take useful actions that help us achieve our desired outcomes. So it's basically about giving people the tools to do what they want in their lives, to achieve their visions. And what's interesting about this is if you give people the support to be more competent and to skill up, it can actually boost their intrinsic motivation and performance. They get more fulfillment from the task itself, they're more motivated to show up to work, etc. So a good example from an e-commerce perspective, instead of selling something online like this, which is a generic e-commerce website, you have to trawl through, it's a bit fumbly, or for instance, this other one that you have pretty much the same sort of setup. Instead of something that's generic and not particularly exciting, you can try this instead. You can use an app that's going to be situated in someone's phone. So you're meeting them on a device in which they are highly competent, typically. You're giving them the opportunity to try on a virtual pair of glasses in their own home. So you're giving them the skills to find the right pair. And I know, having tried glasses before, how complex this can be. And that you're making it simple. Everyone who owns a smartphone, certainly in the target group of the younger demographic they're aiming for, will have had an experience with how to do this. Same thing with Nike, point and shoot. Want to buy a pair of shoes? Download the app, point it towards your feet, and they will suggest to you which are the best fitting sneakers, even when you can't go into the store. And it's done so well that other companies are now also using AR in order to reach out to consumers. The third and final need is about the desire to belong, our desire for relatedness. And it's about this drive to feel accepted and understood and validated and appreciated by our peers and significant others. And increasingly, this is becoming important in business context because it's also one of the strongest predictors of healthy relationships and well-being. So if you want to bring people together back into the office or behind a mission, relatedness and belonging is key. So instead of bringing in generic lineups of the usual suspects that you might expect for a particular role or job title, you can try this. You can go for something just a little bit different. You can go off the beaten path and consciously select people who otherwise might previously have been unjustly overlooked. So to recap quickly on that, you need to look for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. But we also, and this is the other half of the equation, need to meet shifting expectations more broadly in society. So it's not enough anymore, especially with the pandemic having catalyzed some of these trends, to just offer people a pleasurable short-term hedonic experience, rather than just something short-lasting, pain-avoiding, pleasure-seeking. We need to do something a bit deeper. And this is where purpose and eudaimonic integrity comes in. It's about that fulfillment that we mentioned earlier. People want more. They want both, not just a short hit. They want purpose and meaning. And so this is where we can look at how to cultivate and express integrity throughout our lives and throughout the businesses that we might represent. So, okay, so once we identify and state our values, and I'll give you a tool at the end, a free tool that you can use to do that, we need to understand how to express them to generate credibility and trust, which is so important to the success of any organization. And so this is where the 4 C's come in. Using the example of Ben & Jerry's, to maintain their integrity, they make a public, explicit commitment to uphold certain values. This could be the fact that they were one of the first companies in the world to put social mission equal to profit. They were also one of the first ever wholly owned B Corps. They used their position to influence positive change in the world across a bunch of different ways, whether it's voting rights and racial justice to LGBTQ+ rights and voting reforms. So they make a public explicit commitment. They're then congruent in word and action. It's not just about a nice marketing message. They also team up with organizations that can help them achieve what they're saying they want to do. And they also get people involved, moving back to the autonomy piece again here, get people involved by offering them ways to interact on this specific theme. So it could be local projects or articles, education. The third C is about being consistent over time, building a track record. And here again, Ben & Jerry's is really accomplished. So we know that they've been a vocal ally to the Black Lives Matter movement. And they've been posting educational content, getting involved in local efforts in order to support people seeking social and racial justice. And one of the reasons that they're credible in this space is because they started out quite a long time ago in the wake of the death of 18-year-old Michael Brown in Ferguson. And they've consistently since that time supported this movement with credible evidence-based examples of things that they're doing. But it's not enough just to be consistent. The fourth and final C is about being coherent. So doing the right thing for the right reason. And here again, people are quick to point out that because they've done the other three C's, they're able to show that they can stand alongside others and demonstrate with integrity their support for these campaigns. Whether it's about dismantling white supremacy or defunding the police, they've earned the right to speak on these topics because of their track record. So in conclusion, with that whistle-stop tour, what I'm trying to get at here is that whatever your goals are and whoever your audience is, whether you're in a mom and pop business or you're in an educational organization or even within your own life, if you want to better connect with other people, it can be really helpful to understand the principles, biases, and motivations that drive people. So if you want to learn more, as Emma kindly mentioned at the beginning, there is my book. And if you want to check out how the values in your business express themselves, what they are, and how to use them more consciously throughout your business, you can check out this free tool called thevaluesmap.com, which I developed in relationship with Dr. Kiki Leutner of Goldsmiths University. And with that, I'm going to throw over back to you. Thanks for your kind attention.
Thank you, Natalie. Lots of food for thought there, and lots that I could talk about, but I'm not going to take over this entire webinar to be about me. But thank you very much for that. That was, really great food for thought there. Before I do weigh in, and I will do at some point, I'd like to just pass over to my colleagues on our panel today to just get their view. So perhaps, Kevin, if we can start with you. Kevin, in your view, how might we translate some of the things that Natalie is talking about to the wider world of work?
Thanks for that introduction, Emma. So yeah, just to introduce myself, my name is Kevin Morrell, and I'm the Rowlands Chair in Transformational Strategy. So I'm interested in supporting companies as they make large-scale changes. Thinking about how one might take some of Natalie's framework and apply it to organizations, I find it very interesting that what Natalie's doing and drawing on it in a very nice and light way, but also a sophisticated way, the kind of framework that I would think of as a virtue framework. So using the phrase eudaimonia is an Aristotelian term, and flourishing is too. So I'm a very big fan of that approach. Wrote a book on Aristotle in 2012. And I am going to get round to Emma's question. But I think if I can just take a little step back, there are some things that Aristotle said which are very, very interesting and remain relevant today. So one of his distinctions, which Natalie picked up on, was the distinction between what happiness is as a state versus happiness as an activity. So when Aristotle talks about eudaimonia, he's saying happiness is not a state of mind; it's a verb. It's something that you do, and I think that that's quite important. Linking to Rosina's interest in sustainability. A sustainability strategy is not something that a company has. It should be something that a company does. So I think that eudaimonic framework can apply there too. Another really interesting thing that he said, which I think connects to the changing world of work as well, is he said something really simple but really fascinating and kind of complicated at the same time. He said that the city is prior to the individual. So Aristotle says that to be a person, you have to have the city first. And it's right, inverting that kind of association we might think of. We might think that you only have a city once you have an aggregate of individuals. What Aristotle says is, in order to be fully human and to flourish, you need the city. And so I think that that can be applied to organizations too, because as Emma will know far better than I, a key motivation for many people now joining organizations is that sense of purpose. And actually, if we can think about an organization as something that enables you to be fully human rather than a kind of aggregation of individuals, I think that could be a really promising way of thinking about how we can change and how we can implement some of these ideas and actually live out these ideals of sustainability and flourishing. And I love the phrase bringing the humane into technology as well. So I think there are lots of rich crossovers and connections, and I'm a big fan of that underlying framework.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kevin. I mean, perhaps if I just pick up, because you mentioned me and this desire for meaningful work that people have. I mean, it really struck me as I was listening to Natalie. I mean, Natalie talked about autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And actually in HR, when we're trying to develop employee value propositions and thinking about how we attract people and retain people in the organization, we talk about exactly those things, although perhaps sometimes in different words all the time. I mean, you know, this is really what people are looking for in the workplace and in a job at the moment. It's, you know, so it's not just about consumers, it's really about employees, because, you know, it is about having a job that you've got, you have that autonomy, you can direct your career in the way that you do your work. It is about those relationships. And, you know, and as you said, we've seen that a lot in the last year or so, 18 months now, I guess, you know, about how we've missed those relationships and that ability to build those relationships. And how we interact with people. And it is about developing competence. I mean, you know, part of a good employee value proposition should always be about how we develop people and how we allow people to develop skills, and also then allow them to apply and use those skills in the workplace, because that's what keeps people in. So I was really interested, it really struck me as you were talking about that in a slightly different context, that actually it's identical really to what we talk about a lot in HR. And as you said, Kevin, I mean, this idea of purpose has just become absolutely key in HR and in talent acquisition and talent retention over the last, well, for some time, but I think particularly since the pandemic, because I think what we've seen, you know, we're seeing a lot of talk at the moment about people leaving their jobs, this idea of the great resignation, and people want to, you know, people want a different job and a different career. And really, in a lot of cases, this is because people have, you know, the pandemic has forced people to reflect, forced them to think about actually what they really want out of their job and whether they're getting that. And that actually often comes down to purpose and whether they're doing something meaningful, whether that's about doing something meaningful for the organization or often about whether they're doing something meaningful in broader society. And then, of course, we've seen people reflect and think, do you know what, actually, that's not meaningful for me. So I'm going to look for another job, or I'm going to change my career, or I'm going to use this time I'm on furlough to do some webinars and, you know, and train myself to do something different or to look for another job. So I think these are all themes that are really important actually in my world in HR as well. So I think it's fascinating that we see these cutting across. And I'm guessing that these are also really important in sustainability. I mean, I can see, Rosina, these kind of things really being a basis for strategies around sustainability in organisations.
Yes, so absolutely. Great to hear what you had to say, Natalie, and definitely some parallels with how I'm thinking about and teaching about purpose in the context of companies that are trying to become more sustainable, not be sustainable, as Kevin was saying, but be acting towards more sustainable futures. So talking about purpose at an organisational level, the way I think about this is that when businesses are trying to become more sustainable, they're not just going after profit, obviously. They're going after a much more multifaceted set of objectives. And that causes confusion sometimes, particularly in the transition from one state to another. It's easy to sort of look back and say, yes, Ben and Jerry's have kind of achieved this. But in the transition, the journey towards that, people struggle with how they deal with those trade-offs and the sort of change of values. And at the same time, you know, working towards solutions around sustainability involves companies partnering with lots of other organizations, and how they show up to those organizations, whether that's competitors that they're trying to actually collaborate with around sustainability challenges, or NGOs who are very different from them, but they work with them because they think they can solve solutions better together. In that context of kind of changing priorities and having to sort of be clear about what your priorities are to the outside world, having a sense of purpose is a really crucial sort of North Star for those organizations that helps people make sense of what does this company stand for, and how is that changing over time. So at an organizational level, I think it's really crucial. That purpose is kind of something around which people can align. But then at the individual level, because you talked about the individual level and the organizational level, there therefore then needs to be alignment between personal purpose and organizational purpose. And I do get asked questions about what happens if there isn't alignment. Can I change that from within, or do I need to just leave and go somewhere else? Which an interesting question to put back to you, Emma, in fact. But I think companies like Unilever, who have always been ahead of the curve in terms of their sustainability journey, they are really recognizing that it's when you can unleash individual purpose that supports organizational purpose that you can get the best out of your employees, and you can drive successful businesses. And they've actually been running a program called Discover Your Purpose for the last 2 or 3 years, led by a very visionary chief learning officer in the form of Tim Munden. And they've sent 54,000 employees through this program. So they're really standing by this kind of belief that if you're self-fulfilled, if you feel that your purpose can be fully explored and acted at work, then that's going to drive a much kind of healthier, more successful business into the long term. So I think we can think about purpose at an organizational level and organizational values, and also think about it as on an individual level. And I think finding that congruence between the two is really powerful.
Thanks, Rosina. It's really interesting, isn't it, how this idea of purpose and values and these ideas of autonomy, competence and relatedness, actually, why Natalie is talking really from a consumer perspective, although I know your interests are what's slightly wider than that, that actually they penetrate, across so many different things for organizations. Natalie, do you want to come back on any of those comments as we're all commenting on your presentation?
So it's just so interesting to hear your takes on this, because I think one of the things that you've all kind of alluded to or sort of outright pointed towards is the fact that these themes, first of all, they're not new ideas, right? Aristotle is not a modern man now in our time, where he was a modern thinker in many respects, but he's not contemporary. But I think what is contemporary perhaps is that we're asking these questions at a time when, what we do and how we do it, that takes up a lot of our waking lives. And so if we're going to spend so much time at work and give over so much of our effort, why not have these conversations about how we can make it more meaningful? And I think the thing that I find very interesting is just how easy it is in some ways to apply this lens of relatedness and competence and autonomy or values or purpose or meaning across from the very individual levels, the societal level, within businesses, anything where there is a human-based system. And it needn't even extend simply to humans. I mean, let's take kind of a slightly wider lens on the Hive podcast and talk about, the wider web of life. How do we value the life that we share with non-human beings, which is, another massive question of our time that we've long ignored to our peril. So I think it's a really exciting time to hear that people are starting to find ways to practically create situations like with the example that you gave, Rosina, with Unilever, to see examples of people taking this seriously and the benefits that can be had when they do.
Excellent. One of the things that struck me listening to you then, which I guess is a question for everyone. I mean, we're living at a time where we're talking about some quite difficult things here for organizations to grapple with. I mean, for some organizations that are, I think, that some organizations will be purpose-led from the outset. Some it will be in their DNA, if you'll excuse the expression, and we see that quite a lot with, with small businesses or, quite often. And obviously with, the Ben and Jerry's and the Unilever of the world, they put a lot of work in to make sure that that's absolutely central because of the vision often of individuals that run the organizations. But for someone that runs a business listening to this, and we're saying, well, you need to really put purpose at the center of your organization at a time where actually they might be fighting for survival, given what's happening in the external climate. I mean, what would your words be, any of you? I'm just interested, really, because I talk to a lot of organizations and I have these conversations and they're like, well, that's all very well, Emma, but, actually, we're in the middle of a pandemic, we've got people on furlough, we're in hospitality, so so we've got no customers, etc., and we're fighting for survival here. So how do we do that, and how important is it that companies still do that at this time? Sorry, that was a very long question.
I get that's really yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. I guess there's perhaps a danger of being carried away or romanticizing what purpose is. I mean, Unilever is absolutely ahead of the curve and so on, but they run some massive brands, and the consumers don't really always think about purpose when they're buying some of their brands. So it's an interesting question for the organization. Yes, there's the individual in the organization, but whether purpose cuts through all the time in every Unilever purchasing decision, but I think where purpose
when I go and buy a Magnum, I'm not thinking about purpose. Is that what you mean?
Well, yeah. Maybe you are, because they're bringing out a new formulation of Magnum, which is for vegans. But anyway, that's a little digression. But one thing that one can say about purpose is that it actually provides a basis for an organization to implement large-scale change. I guess there are two main drivers of whether you can implement change successfully. One is if people within the organization have a working answer to the question, who are we as an organization, which is a kind of, identification that can help steer you through large scale change. And a second aspect to it is if you have a clear answer as to how your organization makes the world a better place, which is the answer to the purpose question, that can also help you to coordinate and resolve ambiguities and complexities when you're confronting large-scale change. So purpose is not just a romantic notion, it can also give you a hard competitive edge, because if everybody shares that sense of purpose, then it's easier to implement large-scale change, I would say.
I kind of think about it in terms of there being a number of routes that purpose can actually drive success and profit ultimately. One is differentiation, as Kevin said, Ben and Jerry standing out because they have got this kind of advocacy around issues, which maybe not at the margin at that moment. You're actually at the shop. It might not necessarily 100% drive your decision, but over time, that kind of brand affinity, I think it does make a difference. And I always think of brands like Lush, where you walk in there and you feel coming across from the people that are serving you how passionate they are about the sustainability credentials of their product. So the one's about differentiation, the other's about the fact that employee engagement drives customer satisfaction. I used to work at Argos. People in the front line who are really happy about their jobs, really engaged with what they're doing, they do sell things better and they do serve people better. So that's another route through to actually driving profit. And then there's also legitimacy that it can achieve for you, whether that's in the eyes of your buyer. If you're selling B2B, that could be in the eyes of your customers, in the eyes of other organizations that you want to work with, as I said at the beginning. Just being a preferred partner or a preferred supplier can deliver results as well. So, but the problem is, as you said, Emma, these things can take time to come through. Those sort of value, upsides can take a while to come through. So, the message is to, if you take a longer term view, if you can step back and take a longer term view of what is it going to take for me to be successful in the long run, it's worth the investment.
Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing there is that actually, purpose can be the route to survival, actually, through a number of different ways if you get it right. I'm keen to, at this point, and this is not to stop my colleagues from talking at all, but I am keen to make sure that we do involve other people into this discussion. I'm really keen, as is always the point always the case at this point in any webinar, people are reluctant at coming forward with questions. Can I just say to the audience, if you do have any questions or you want to put your hand up and join in and make a point, please do. We are really, really keen to get your views on these ideas around purpose and values and any of the issues that we're talking about. That's why we've got different perspectives and a cross-disciplinary approach today. So please do feel free to join in. And with that in mind, I'm very pleased to say that Max, who is a good colleague of mine as well, so I'm very happy to see him up there, has put his hand up. So Max, do you want to chip in there?
Thank you very much, Emma. Yes, what a amazing conversation, I have to say, and the different perspectives on the same topic is just such a treat, you know, from the Greek philosopher to the HR to the organization to the values. What more could one ask on a Thursday afternoon? So my question really is, I don't know whether I'm being contrarian or not, but a lot of people would say it wouldn't surprise them at all. My question is this. I think that commercial organizations, at any rate, their goal is to maximize productivity in the service of the shareholder. Right, you know, that's what they do. I believe, informed by perhaps a psychology background, that the employee goal, and I think purpose is good, but I want to be more specific. I'm going to say it's about actualization, so I can measure it and put something, not that I can measure actualization, but just a tighter firm. I think that those two are in direct conflict. I know that people are going to say, oh, there are creative ways of being more productive and actualizing. That's probably true, but I'm not convinced that the executive team are necessarily that interested in whether the way they come up with helps people to self-actualize or not. So my question is this a systemic problem? You know, is it possible to achieve actualization and happy shareholders with maximally productive workforces under capitalism? You know, I'm a capitalist mostly. Is it possible to have the two groups being happy together?
I just, point of clarification, Max, aren't shareholders also self-actualizing individuals?
Absolutely. I mean,
they're also people.
Yeah. So if I take a peep under the hood, I would completely agree with that. And as a geek, I would say that this is an optimization problem. You know, they say my PhD was about what makes happy couple relationships. You know, is it more about personality communication? And we learned that the answer is compromise, which is a situation where both of you change things so that neither of you are happy. And I wonder whether with shareholders and employees and the executive team, whether, you know, the answer under capitalism is that you've got to make a compromise. It isn't possible to maximize all three of those happinesses at the same time. That's my current thinking about the world of commerce. But yeah, I'm happy for somebody to say, Max, you're utterly wrong.
Natalie, do you have any thoughts on that? Because obviously, you know, we're building on your starting point.
It's so interesting, Max, hearing you bring up that question and talk about self-actualization. I feel like this is a conversation that needs to have many hours to it with a few drinks and some. So interestingly, I'm not sure how to answer, but I think there's obviously the desire for self-actualization. If we look at it from the point of view as one of these needs that is nice to have, that's beyond the physiological basic needs that need to be met, and as something which is a North Star goal. We never achieve, well, some people might argue that sages achieve self-actualization, but for us mere mortals, it's something which is more of a way of living in which we experience pockets of time where we feel more in flow, more ourselves, etc. I think when we talk about that, then I don't think it necessarily has to be incompatible with making money. That being said, I think if the primary drive is to make and acquire as much money and power as possible, to me that feels like not a comfortable bedfellow for self-actualization. And that, in fact, when you look at the research around heightened materialism, the more you value materialism, typically it has correlations with negative mental health, with issues around stress. There's all sorts of knock-on effects that are correlational. Well, I can't say knock-on effects if it's correlational, but all sorts of clusters of effects that are found with heightened materialism that suggest that a predominantly capitalist mindset is not going to give you a sense of eudaimonia or well-being. And so I guess the question, to kind of fling it back to you in a sense, is what role does capitalism have in either helping or hindering us to fulfill our potential or an ongoing sense of flourishing? Because I think unless we completely transform the system, I don't mean completely get rid of money necessarily, but unless we kind of make it more possible for people to flourish in more ways than just they're required to flourish at work, unless we create that possibility, it's going to be very hard to reconcile those two things. I don't know if I'm being particularly clear. It's kind of there's lots of threads to pull on.
You are. I mean, sorry, please.
I wonder whether there's one of my master's students recently wrote a really good paper on different well-being indicators that have been tried around the world as an alternative to GDP. as a way of kind of thinking about how can we set a different measure of what, you know, what a good life is, and talking about the Thai wellness indicator, for example, and the Bhutanese indicators. And, you know, I wonder whether capitalism could be in service to something higher rather than being the ends. So maybe it's not capitalism but it's broken, but it's the way that we're still wedded to the measures of success that were invented in, you know, post-war years. And why are we still so beholden to GDP as the only way we look at human progress? So maybe it can still be a means, but we have to think about higher ends. I don't know.
But I find so often that in the average transformation of a commercial organization, again, because we have done, I have had the privilege of working with Paul Taffender doing transformations at charities, like Lloyd's Register is a charity. But the attitude is pretty similar. You know, we say you've got to be giving people in the organization more. They are not happy. But what about the shareholders? You know, that money we could be putting back as a dividend. And I say, but you could be offering additional development. And even at the BP, I don't know if there's anybody from BP here, I hope they aren't a big sponsor or something. But you know, even at the BP shareholder meeting that I went to 2 years ago, somebody stood up, one of the pension funds stood up and said, what is all this money going into employee development? Because, you know, on the balance sheet, you like to have little numbers dotted around to show how much you're doing. And they said, you know, do we need to be spending that much on development? Shouldn't we be putting that money into the pockets of the shareholders? And I kind of thought, oh, we have a long way to go if the big shareholder companies are thinking that way, is that it's shareholders versus employees. And I quite agree with both of your points, really, that you can't maximize productivity unless you have a happy and a workforce with a sense of well-being. But how do you convince, maybe that's the question, is how do you convince executive teams of that? Maybe that's the question. Don't know the answer.
There was also an interesting quote I'm going to draw up here from the World Economic Forum founder, Klaus Schwab, who talked about the global response to COVID being a litmus test for stakeholder capitalism. So the idea that actually when we look at the value of a business, either from within it or as a consumer or as a partner, it's not enough just to say, well, who's benefiting financially and looking just at the shareholder. It's more like, well, who are the stakeholders in this business? Also, if we don't have a planet to have businesses on, we're all going to be absolutely screwed. So it's kind of, we have to open up the lens. And I think people now are begrudgingly getting to the point where they're having to widen that lens, because if not doing so will be absolutely catastrophic.
Thank you.
We do have a couple of other hands, so I'm going to move on. Alessandra, your hand went up suddenly in the middle of that, as though you had a burning question. So I'm going to come to you next.
Great, thank you. Yeah, perhaps not such a burning question directly there, but I did, as when Nathalie was talking earlier, there were some bits mentioned about technology and how technology might help make some of bring some of these points up by making the virtual environment more engaging as well, and perhaps have allow people to have a more direct contact with brands and so on. So what, I don't know if there's a lot of buzz going around right now with something called the metaverse. So how do you think a lot of these values that have been mentioned can perhaps be brought into the virtual world through technologies like the ones being developed for the metaverse?
That's a very complex question. So one of the things to widen the sphere, I think one of the things that I've been finding cropping up in conversations about the metaverse, which have been very nascent conversations, I am not an expert by any stretch whatsoever, but about the metaverse and about the similar sort of state or quality of excitement that people are bringing to the metaverse idea now. This thing could be revolutionary, it's going to be amazing. And the fact that it has a similar vibe to when people started, flocking to social channels like Facebook back in the day, and how badly that worked out by many accounts. I don't know if you're looking at like papers coming out about the Instagram, like Facebook knowledge about Instagram impacting young women in particular with body esteem issues, suicide rates. So some really damning stuff coming out as to what they've been optimized for, intentionally or not, and their failure to meet certain responsibilities around protecting users from worst case scenarios. So I think when it comes to the metaverse and thinking about values, I would actually be quite happy, at least as the first step, if people started thinking, how do we get more people from a diverse range of ages, ethnicities, sexes, gender orientation, the whole shebang in on the conversation, so we can widen and make richer the context in which technology is developed. So I think unless we address that fundamental question of how do we get everyone to the table and make it possible to discuss difference, to have the uncomfortable conversations, to see how we want to create systems that enrich our lives, and to do that intentionally, which also means having psychological safety and leaning into the painful or emotionally uncomfortable questions. Unless we can address that fundamental question, in my view, it's going to be very difficult to get the best out of these new technologies or the building on previous technologies that create new systems, because it's going to be an iteration of what came before, and what came before is failing us. I feel free to disagree. That's just my opinion.
No, it's just interesting because so I'm business development director at a company called vGather, which arguably would be developing technologies for this kind of area. So I was interested to hear, because a lot of the focus right now goes into how to bring brands and customers closer together, and how to bring a lot of the let's say we move a lot around events, and one of the key things about events is engagement, right? When you go to an event, you have the chance to talk to people directly, you have the chance to have direct interactions, and that's one of the things that up until now, and especially due to the pandemic, has been quite difficult. You can't build a closer relationship with someone just merely by having a conversation like we were having right now through a webinar, right? It's a little bit more difficult. There's less tools for interaction.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a lot of the things that I guess the metaverse is bringing, but I don't know, because there's been so much focus right now on the technology itself and what it can bring in terms of communication and let's say everything is revolving around the shiny parts of the technology, but perhaps there's not a lot being discussed about the values behind it, and how it actually might cause further issues like the one you mentioned with Instagram, or actually help solve some of these problems. So I just thought it would,
It's an excellent question.
Because there's a whole new conversation behind that. I think a whole new webinar. Kevin.
Sorry.
So just on that point. So the 4 C's framework, which, the commitment, coherence, congruence, and consistency. Another way that you could talk about that from a eudaimonic type perspective is to describe those as virtues. So one of the things that Aristotle teaches us, every few weeks you see something that says the latest in brain science reveals, and it's something that he said 2,500 years ago. But one of the things that he talks about is how virtues are emotions that have been trained. So it's not that there's a separation of reason and emotion in the decision-making process. Reason is integral to decision-making, but so are emotions too. So linking that to the idea of a metaverse as like a kind of simulacrum of life, one thing that could be is it could be a means of learning how to train emotions, and ideally, when we think about sustainability or acting ethically, that is not just a calculation. It's an emotional impulse, but it's one that's been learned in a social context. It's been reinforced. There's a conceptual architecture supporting it. It's built up with habits and so on. So that's one way you could connect the metaverse to this, is thinking about virtues and how they're learned.
Mm-hmm. The other specific example I've seen is the way that, related to what you're saying, Kevin, is using, this is just virtual reality, but to create empathy with people on a global basis. So this was some, I can't remember what group they were working with, but basically trying to take them to the Amazon so they could, because the argument is that you can't sort of have empathy for something that you don't understand or experience. So I thought that was a really interesting practical thing that's been tried just with current technology.
And there's a lot of interesting stuff around that with, I can't remember which, was it Noni de Pena, I think, who did some really interesting video games or like immersive environments in which you can actually walk in the shoes of someone who is a refugee and get some sort of virtually embodied sense of what it is to walk around with a different identity. I think what's going to be interesting is when we start moving into, and I don't know how far along this is, but embodied machines. There's a brilliant tech ethicist who works in AI. Her name is Nell Watson. I spoke with her for the book, among other things. And she was talking about this being something which is in the near-term future, 5 to 10 years, and what that might mean. Like, how do we, what does that mean for the way in which we relate to our world? How do we bring virtues and values and ethics into robotics? If we're embodying machines so that they can learn how to replicate our actions, what does that mean in terms of what we bring from a psychological, ethical, philosophical perspective as well? And how does that express itself, through our interactions with the machine? And it's such an interesting nascent space.
Going back to, going back to Rosina's point. So one thing the fair trade movement did was it countered globalization. So what globalization does, it shrinks the world in some ways, but in other ways it creates distance. So when you see something in the supermarket shelf that has come from thousands of miles away, that distance has been shrunk, but actually your gap between yourself and the person who's produced it has grown because the supermarket has mediated that. So something like, that could be one way of, thinking about virtue.
Oh, we're losing Kevin.
No, that was my emphatic finish there, Emma. Okay,
that's all right then. Okay, I'm aware that Menji has had her hand up for some time. There was quite an interesting conversation emerging in the chat around Menji's comments, so I did encourage her to actually chip in. Thank you, Alexandro, by the way. You've disappeared now, I think. Oh, there you are. You went under the table or something. So
sorry, yeah, my the charger for my computer disconnected. Yeah, no, my pleasure. Yeah, it's great to hear the different opinions around the subject.
Thank you. Menji, I know your camera is broken at the moment, so we won't force you to turn it on, but did you want to unmute and actually ask your question to get some...
Thank you, Emma. Thanks for encouragement. Because my laptop just fell down and the quality of my camera is not very good, but just want to briefly open it and say hello to everybody. Yeah, like the comments I make in the chat box, thank you everybody for the fascinating discussion so far. I gained a lot of food for thought from different perspectives. So my question is, it's really like what triggers me is one of my first year PhD students, she started to work on meaningfulness at work. And she finds out not only based on the SET's self-determined theory, the 3 aspects like Natalie mentioned very well in the book. She also wants to look at the beneficence, because there's some theorists have emphasized how beneficence, the sense of having a pro-social impact, can be a key source of meaningfulness. So I'm wondering, Natalie, have you think about incorporate that one in your book or any source on that?
That's such a lovely, I'm glad that you brought it in and thank you. Yes, so it's interesting. I didn't use the word beneficence and I really like that word. I didn't use it in my book, but there are some interesting examples where people take seemingly pro-social actions at their own cost in order to benefit others and the results that that yields. So an example which was kind of blending this within the way that people run organizations. There's a CEO of a company called Gravity Payments. You may have heard this, it's been quite well documented by now, but it's such a good example. His name is Dan Price and they're based in Seattle, and Gravity Payments is a company that extends loans to smaller businesses that were very hard hit in the pandemic. They were in existence before the pandemic, and before the pandemic hit, he had been talking with one of his friends who was discussing her life and basically said, look, on a payment of $40,000 a year, I can't even meet my rent because the rents have gone up. And as a result, the story goes of this conversation, he decides, as a now multi-million-dollar worth owner of this company, that he's going to take a massive pay cut and bring up the yearly salary of everyone within the company to at least $70,000, which is huge. And so he takes a pay cut, he does it, it allows people to move closer in, they feel more committed to the company, they're able to support their children going to school, get healthcare, etc. And then the pandemic hits. And then what happens is within, I think it's like 3 months, if they don't do something to stop the amount of money going out, they're going to have to start laying people off. And so they bring everyone together within the company, and the employees basically volunteer to take pay cuts. Some of them take no salary for 3 months, others take a reduction, and that enables them to not fire a single person, to not raise the interest rates on the loans to the small businesses that are already struggling during the pandemic. And as a result of that, through his pro-social action and values transmitted throughout the company, in his time of need and the company's time of need, people volunteered their help in order to work together as a team for a larger purpose. And for me, that's such an interesting example, because often we think about the wider purpose as being something that exists in the realm of charity or NGOs or education. And I think what's exciting about this example is that we can turn it into or inwards towards organizations that are wanting to make money and to do business. So yeah, from that perspective, I thought it was an interesting way of kind of taking a hit for yourself, doing something for the greater good, and it having a wonderful knock-on effect. And now he's a really vocal advocate for other companies taking similar actions. I know I've kind of taken us down a very specific route, but I hope that's kind of weaves into your points around beneficence.
Yeah, that's a very representative example, I think. Yeah, a very, very good one to demonstrate the point, how we incorporate beneficence into it. I think there are a lot of research around beneficent leadership and mindfulness and how we think about it, and some of them from the religious perspective, like it related to some like Zenism. What's that called? Zenism, yeah. And some of them from Confucianism, which is Eastern Asia's culture, Confucianism. Yeah, so my PhD student actually is looking at, they want to say beneficent is a predictor for the meaningful work, and they want to find out beneficent actually have no cultural heterogeneous. It can be applied to different business contexts across a country. I think that would be very interesting. I will share the story you just told me. You just told me to her, definitely. Very good example.
Please share your research with me. It sounds so exciting, and we need that kind of stuff being broadcast more widely so people can see what's possible. I'd love to hear more.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Menji. I really appreciate that contribution. Look forward to hearing more about that. I am aware of time. Would you believe it's 4:30? So our time is actually up. Just to say thank you, Max, who has put an update on the Dan Price story in the chat, if anyone is interested. So it's just left for me to do thank yous and I guess an update on what our next webinar will be. So first of all, let me say a massive thank you to Natalie for coming along and sharing her ideas from her new book and joining in our conversation today. Much appreciated, Natalie. Thank you very much. And also a massive thank you to my colleagues, Kevin and Rosina, for when I said, hey, come and join in this conversation, because I think you might have interesting perspectives, saying yes, because that's always the right answer. And it's not. So thank you very much for that. I feel as though this conversation could run for a bit longer, and because I think we, scratched the surface, but it's really, really interesting. So thank you so much to all of you. I really appreciate it. And thank you to all of you that joined in and asked questions. That's also much appreciated. Right, I am just going to try and share a slide here about our next webinar. As you know, I always try and plug the next one. Max has done a good bit of a trailer for this himself today, I think, by unmuting and speaking. So we are having quite a different problem. We're moving back to something that I guess is much more focused on the HR area, although I think there are some actual wider lessons here, Max, I think it would be fair to say. So on the 21st of October, We will be joined by Max Bloomberg and another colleague, Dave Milner, who some of you will be familiar from his work as HR curator, who will be coming along and talking about a business-driven HR operating model for the digital era. Max, as you're here, do you want to say anything about what you're going to be talking about very briefly?
Yeah, thank you. I wasn't expecting that, but I think your
Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot.
is pretty good. I think it's fairly clear that in many organizations, back to the good old executive teams, are not always delighted with the way that HR operates, and I think that HR is not reaching its potential if we talk about a sense of purpose and potential. And the idea of this model, which I've implemented at Swarovski, ABB, and one or two other companies, has really made a difference to the way that HR operates in the company and gives them more of a voice. I'm not sure that it's right for every company in the world, but it's certainly a great discussion point, and that's what I would look forward to doing on the 21st, and getting input from like this from the group would be wonderful.
Brilliant, thank you, Max. And so as Monty Python would say, now for something completely different next time, I think. But I think you've done a very good job there actually of explaining how it does actually build on some of the ideas that we've discussed today. So just to say thank you again, thank you for our panelists, thank you to everyone for coming along and engaging with the Changing World of Work group. If you do want to get in touch, then please do get in touch with me or engage with us on social media. We're all there doing various things. So please do engage, and we hope to see you at a webinar in the future. I will be circulating the registration details for that next one soon. Great to see you all, and thank you very much. And as usual in the current times, stay safe, stay healthy, and have a good rest of the week.